There's a particular sort of argument, which indeed isn't an argument, yet a method for preventing banter and extorting an adversary's argument with one's undiscussed ideas. It is a technique for bypassing rationale through mental tension. It comprises of taking steps to impeach an adversary's personality through his argument, along these lines denouncing the argument without debate. In the present epistemological wilderness, that subsequent technique is utilized more regularly than some sort of irrational argument. It should be delegated an intelligent paradox and might be assigned as the argument from intimidation. The fundamental quality of the argument from intimidation is its allure for moral self-question and dependence on fair responsibility or obliviousness of the person in question. It is utilized as a final offer requesting that the casualty renounce a given thought without conversation, under danger of being viewed as ethically disgraceful. This Ayn Rand Reid describes as the argument from intimidation. In her article, she explains what the term means and how it affects us. This video serves as a critique of Rand's article, where myself, Nicholas Burrows, Xavier Wildgoose, Deanthea Wilson, Roshanti DeVoe, Marvinique Brown, Janicia Pinder, and Antonio Gray will also rely our thoughts on the argument from intimidation. Over to you, Xavier.
In Ayn Rand's work, she explains that the psychological source behind the argument of intimidation is a science called social metaphysics. A social metaphysician is when one individual who believes that their innate consciousness holds no superiority to that of the opinions of others and refuses the facts of actuality. This individual also seeks moral approval no matter what logic, truth, or reasoning is presented. They are also innately afraid of what others would think and will intensely deny it even if evidence is placed right in front of them. They also disregard their own consciousness in order to appease others. It is those reasons why a social metaphysician can hope to win an argument by pointing out that if an individual truly believes in what they say, other individuals will not like what that person has said. Such nature has become one's instinct to approach any exchange with another individual, to listen and to analyze the words in which they speak in order to break it down and to articulate their opinion so that they can decide whether what they say is right or wrong. They listen to the tone of their voice and, depending on how convincingly they may sound, they answer accordingly. This certain type of individual cannot handle that their way of thinking or opinion is challenged. So as a defense mechanism, this person resorts to verbal assault, which adheres to a person's moral sanction. It takes a certain type of a person to succumb to the argument's motive. They are an easy target because they hold a sense of pride and moral guidance. Their innocence makes it hard for them to see what the intent of the argument is and makes it difficult to process as a result. This type of person also falls victim to assuming that whoever is using the argument knows something about them. So as a response, they give the attacker what they want, and that is the benefit of the doubt, and they completely withdraw from their viewpoint. Such evidence of this argument is often used to target individuals who are young and full of innocence. For example, Ayn Rand uses an example of the college classroom in which she mentions that many professors practice this argument. They use it as a means to stifle those whose genuine or thought-provoking questions do not adhere with the professor's views, line of thinking, or in perhaps certain cases, it is used as a defense mechanism in case they do not know the answer. They do this in order to keep the status quo.
Pertaining to the story The Emperor's New Clothes, we are given an example of deception. The Charlestons claim that the piece of garment is only invisible to those depraved at heart. The emperor, not wanting to fall subject to their tricks, claims that the garment is visible and proceeds to parade the streets naked. This is a great example of how we may all fall victim to scoundrels every day. We deny the fact that we may be morally unworthy, therefore, we're unable to see the tricks being played before our eyes. Taking a closer look into how we may be intimidated, a few examples were given. We can see through the constant use of the word only, a forced perspective being played and the idea of not wanting to stand out. Only those who lack, only the ignorant, only the black-hearted, only the superficial. An unwanted label is being placed onto these people and giving the sense that they're the ones that need to change. that they're the ones that are wrong and no other point of view is acceptable. We can see through this form of intimidation in modern art today. To be considered elite, art is judged simply by not how much work is put into it, but by making something simple and giving it a larger meaning. Therefore, a painting with a single line is given more direction. Why? One can claim it touched their soul, speaks volume, that it holds the weight of 1,000 feathers. Is it good art, or are you being swayed? Now on to Rashanti.
The argument from intimidation presents itself in two distinct forms in modern discourse. The first form operates as a moral threat and is present in all types of public discourse, including but not limited to the public speeches and print media. The second form appears in private discourse and is conveyed indirectly using condescending tones. For instance, someone might declare, "Surely you are not an advocate of capitalism, are you?" By making such an assertion, they are indirectly suggesting that one's morality is compromised if one supports capitalism. Metaphysicians are most susceptible to being victims of the argument from intimidation. A metaphysician is someone who believes other people are smarter than them. Moreover, the metaphysician is less concerned about the truth and places more emphasis on being liked by others. When faced with opposition, the metaphysician abandons their position to avoid their morality being brought into disrepute. However, if one is not discouraged by the argument from intimidation and decides to challenge its users, it would become clear their arguments are not grounded in logic and lack evidence to support their claims. Now to you.
Thank you, Ashanti. The article that we are going to critique today is The Argument from Intimidation by Annie Rand. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the word intimidation means to make timid or fearful. In this article, the author illustrates how the argument from intimidation can be displayed in many different scenarios. She states that the essential characteristics of the argument from intimidation is its appeal to moral self-doubt and its reliance on the fear, guilt, or ignorance of the victim. It is used in the form of an ultimatum demanding that the victim renounce a given idea without discussion, under the threat of being considered morally unworthy. For example, the story of the emperor with the new clothes was illustrated, and this is basically about some charlatans that were selling non-existent garments, and they claimed that their unusual beauty of the garments made them invisible. And because of this, they relied on the emperor's self-doubt. However, the emperor does not question their moral authority, and he claimed that he could see the clothes when he knew he couldn't, and proceeded to wear the garments. By doing so, the emperor avoided the reliance of fear and his own self-consciousness, which means that he denied the evidence from his own eyes and decided to take the risk of being seen in public naked. The act of doubting oneself, even if you are right, displays net utility, because you are providing the most favorable balance of happiness over unhappiness for all concerned. The emperor knew that he could not see the garments from the charlatans, but because he did not want to question their moral integrity, he denied his own self for the greater good, which means, in other words, that he invalidated himself to keep the charlatans happy. However, the views from impartiality claim that everyone's happiness counts equally and that nobody is more important than the other. The author failed to consider the fact that it is not enough to know to be right. One must know that they are right. And because of the argument from intimidation, if a person doubts themselves, they are most likely to make their decision based on the reliance of fear, and the opposition will take advantage of this and rely on the individual's ignorance to trust their self-consciousness. The veil of ignorance can be taken into consideration because, as humans, we can never make unbiased decisions unless we are behind the veil of ignorance. Rawls believes that whenever we are answering questions behind the veil, it is the only way to ensure that the result is fair. Therefore, if the emperor was to answer behind the veil of ignorance, even though he would not be certain that the garment does exist, this will permit him to answer as it pertains to his own self-consciousness, which means that his answer will result in one that did not question his self, which disregards the act of answering with the reliance of fear, which discontinues the argument from intimidation. Over to you, Janicia.
Thank you, Marvinique. In the argument from intimidation, Rand speaks more to moral self-doubt of an individual. According to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, self-doubt is defined as a lack of faith in oneself or uncertainty of one's abilities, actions, etc. The terms of arguments that can be agreed with is the term relating to the college classroom and how many professors use this argument in their classrooms. This argument is used in the way that it restrains independent thinkers in the classroom. The purpose of this is to basically pull apart questions that cannot be answered and discourage their assumptions. This is also used as a way of keeping the status quo as previously stated in the article. This particular argument can be agreed with simply because it is seen in day-to-day university life when professors play the devil's advocate in order to restrict said students from answering questions that are posed. In most cases, persons who are very small-minded and persons who are shallow thinkers are usually the individuals to fall victim to this argument. The author's views might be criticized as it relates to this argument simply because there may be some students involved in this example of the argument who stand heavily on autonomy. This means that they are able to make their own decisions and are self-directed. These students never waver their thoughts, no matter how much they are persuaded to do so. The author's position can be strengthened by actually using factual points in order to restrain a student's thinking. Over to you, Antonia.
Highlights the focal point of the argument of intimidation, the attempt to substitute psychological pressure for rational argument. Essentially, we have gathered and elaborated on the strong viewpoints and arguments of the author's claims. Now we can conclude that when presented with other principles, the argument of intimidation is not a convincing argument because it must rely on the opponent's moral integrity rather than the validity and factual semblance of an argument. As previously stated, the opponents can display the act of net utility, which corresponds with the principle of beneficence and non-maleficence, or they can display the principle of autonomy and sustain self-assurance. This poses a dilemma for the argument of intimidation when faced with a morally inclined person, suggesting that the intimidation alone has no substance. People who engage in the argument from intimidation do so because, as Rand put it, they have no arguments, no evidence, no proof, no reason, no ground to stand on. Their use of this method is a confession of intellectual impotence.